You know, in business, it often makes sense to follow one's passions, mostly because that's where a great deal of creative and analytical thinking takes place. And passions carry bucket loads of energy, which is an essential ingredient for any successful business. I have several passions which sometimes work with unintended consequences, and there are several that include geography, history, and especially the Arctic regions. So I curled up one day with the Lost Franklin expedition and unintentionally became completely lost and inspired with the story of Lost Franklin and Bathurst Inlet and the resident Inuit who can trace their ancestors back 5,000 years. And here is the amazing region we will be visiting on this story. It might be useful to paint a clear picture of Sir John Franklin, who he was and the life and times when he did his major exploration. At that time of his appointment, he was 57 years old and was viewed as rather mature, if I may say, by a number of his confreres in the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy. They were somewhat younger and viewed his appointment as maybe a little bit tiresome. What is also amazing is that nobody at that time was sure if the Northwest Passage actually existed. How about that? And I have to wonder what Sir John Franklin and Lady Jane were thinking as they got out the Admiralty charts and looked at the northern part of North America and wondered if the passage really did exist. The complexity of islands, the archipelagos, and the reports of massive ice packs from the whaling fleets must have led this to be a rather challenging potential. He was born in 1786 in Lincolnshire. He was a Lincolnshire man and became a junior sailor at age 14. He fought at the war against Napoleon. He saw action under Lord Nelson at Trafalgar, and he was alongside Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. Pretty good logbook for an officer, I would say. He then spent time in Australia representing the Crown as Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania, which was then called Van Diemen's Land. Franklin's view on reforming the penal colony and his other liberal ideas were not exactly popular amongst his Australian peers. He was a bit of a curious combination of a liberal thinker and reformer and a battle-hardened adventurer ready for action. So when the opportunity to lead the greatest expedition England had ever mounted, John Franklin answered the call. In 1819, which was the same year when Queen Victoria was born, Franklin was already trekking overland through Canada, past Hudson Bay, to survey the Arctic coastline of the North American continent. This was also an opportunity for Franklin and his men to get to understand the difficult kind of terrain they have to push through during an average Canadian winter, and certainly in these northern latitudes it must have been an absolute ordeal every single day. The Coppermine River, which is not too far from Bathurst Inlet. On his return journey, disaster overcame his expedition due to cripplingly cold weather and starvation due to lack of sufficient rations. He eventually arrived in England, the worse for weather, and lost several men en route. The two ships that they chose for Franklin's expedition, the Erebus and the Terror, were superb vessels. Their seaworthiness had been tested with their previous captains, and they were especially equipped for what they surmised would be a pretty tough expedition. The bows of the ships were first reinforced with plates of inch-thick iron to protect the wood from being sliced open by shards of ice, and amazingly both ships had a form of central heating powered by a rudimentary steam boiler which piped hot water beneath the outer deck along the cabins and through the crew quarters. Amazingly, the ability to create fresh water out of seawater with an early 19th century desalination device. What was totally revolutionary was the inserting of an entire locomotive inside the hull of each ship, coupled to a series of propellers to assist the traditional sail power of these vessels. These locomotives weighed over 12 tons each and came from the London to Greenwich Railroad Company. But it was a monumental challenge to do this, and every nook and cranny of these ships was packed with food and general supplies. Their supplies included just about everything you could think of. Flour, of course, liquor, wine, a lot of chocolate, lots of tea, predictably, several thousand tins with preserved soups, meats and vegetables, a rather large supply of tobacco, quite a bit of soap, of course candles, which they would needed, skin blankets to help them sleep at night, of course, and a lot of lemon juice to ward off the dreaded scurvy. A considerable mix of talents would be needed to outfit the expedition. Franklin was a good planner, and behind his two ships was a third ship, a supply ship, full of live oxen, which were gradually slaughtered for fresh meat for the sailors. However, as history records, Franklin chose the wrong route. He headed straight into immense walls of pack ice that encased both Erebus and Terror for the 2 long, terrifying years. It's now April the 4th, 1850. The media became involved, and the Toronto Globe featured a British government offer of £22,000 reward to anyone offering assistance to Franklin. And this inland. Clues to Franklin's whereabouts were still not that clear, but a picture of his supreme struggle with successive Arctic winters was beginning to emerge. It's now 1853, and the British public were focused on the Crimean War, so enthusiasm for the Franklin search had substantially diminished. Bathurst Inlet Lodge was the brainchild of my good friends Glenn and Trish Warner, a visionary husband and wife team who hailed from Yellowknife in what was then the Northwest Territories of Canada. Glenn's career started as a Canadian Mountie, driving dog teams across the tundra from the delta of the Mackenzie River to the village of Coppermine. Glenn was a man who moved with the times, becoming an accomplished pilot and landing his famous Piper Super Cub in the most unlikely places. I flew with Glenn in his restored Canary Yellow aircraft, and watching his steady hand on the stick was an experience to cherish. Glenn and Trish developed a deep friendship with a group of Inuit people living in Bathurst Inlet called the Kingaunmiut, or People of the Nose. The Kingaunmiut traced their ancestors back 5,000 years. What emerged from the friendship was Bathurst Inlet Lodge. This was a humble affair. Trish and Glenn Warner really created it with their own hands and with the help of their Inuit partners, using a former Hudson Bay trading post and a small oblate missionary church. A history and nature centre located 30 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and located at the extreme southern end of an Arctic fjord, Bathurst Inlet is a beautiful place and had a small Hudson Bay trading post. It also had a tiny church, and these two institutions served the immediate region, with the Hudson Bay buying furs from the hunters and the oblate fathers in the church ministering to their souls. Franklin passed through Bathurst Inlet on one of his expeditions, and as Glenn Warner was interested in history and knew about the lost Franklin expedition, a plan began to formulate that would bring together an entirely new type of tourism. Franklin was a tenacious man, participating in several expeditions to the Canadian Arctic. His second attempt was an overland trek from the south of Hudson Bay towards the Coppermine region, passing through Bathurst Inlet. This ended in disaster, with many of his party dying of starvation. Food was so scarce that the men ate lichen they scraped from the rocks, and eventually they actually boiled their boots to soften the leather, which earned Franklin the nickname of the man who ate his boots. The 1845 expedition was a tragic example of inflexible hierarchical thinking, complete with a few unintended blunders. These men were a cut above the rest when it came to resourcefulness and sheer drive, but it remained to be seen if their colonial attitude and their navy-based discipline and maritime techniques could beat nature in such a harsh and terrifying environment. What Franklin faced on the 1845 expedition was an enemy far more subtle and irresistible than Britain had met at Trafalgar or New Orleans or Waterloo. Franklin was up against the awesome power of an Arctic winter, which turned oceans into crushing zones, turning ice and waves into towering mountains, often collapsing on the ships, while the bitter cold sapped brave men's spirits and their strength as the thermometer plunged 40 below. Now, my flight to Bathurst Inlet was not listed on the Toronto airport monitors, nor was it listed at Edmonton's International Airport, and it was not even acknowledged at the airport in Yellowknife. Bathurst Inlet may be a speck on the map. It may be where the lost Franklin expedition passed through while looking for salvation. It may be an exotic destination in a travel brochure, but it did not possess an airport. As Glenn's vision for a history and nature centre moved closer to reality, he had to work out how to transport visitors up to the lodge. But typically, Glenn organised that by using a fleet of Canada's legendary Twin Otter aircraft on floats to land a stone's throw from the village. Another Glenn Warner moment of inspiration came when he flew over a lonely abandoned bulldozer in a nearby community. As Glenn explained to me, if he could somehow repair the diesel engine and restore the hydraulics, he could drive it oh so carefully across country in minus 45 degrees to Bathurst Inlet after the winter had frozen the streams and the local rivers. Using this dozer, he ploughed a gravel runway adjacent to the lodge. I flew out to Bathurst Inlet Lodge surrounded by supplies in the Twin Otter on floats, while the Tundra tire-equipped Twin Otter alongside me flew in formation. The flight took about 2.5 hours, so we stocked up with reading and plenty of snacks, and were soon dozing as the Otters droned north to the Arctic coast. The Twin Otter is one of Canada's most successful aircraft. Originally built by de Havilland Canada and now manufactured by Viking Air in British Columbia, the Twin Otters first flew in 1965 and were an immediate success. Because of their twin engine, short takeoff and landing capability, with a 19-passenger payload and a reputation for being tough and durable, they could sell everything they made. The approach to Bathurst Inlet is quite dramatic. One minute we were flying low over the plateau, and the next moment the land disappeared beneath us as we crossed the ridge with the lodge several hundred feet beneath us. I was now standing on the same earth where Sir John Franklin walked and I was less than 400 feet from the same inlet where his crew members sculled their boats and explored Bathurst Inlet. The accommodations at Bathurst consist of several modest wood chalets with the tiny, compact rooms and the distinctive red and white decommissioned Oblate Catholic Church. This had been converted into a 4-bedroom facility. There was an Inuit community of smiling children, working parents and dignified elders who were looking after us during our stay in their village. And before long, Inuit hosts and guests were chatting away, discussing inevitable questions, such as, what are the winters like? They're pretty brutal. Where do the kids go to school? By boat to Coppermine. And how do they feel about the rest of Canada? Well, they feel belonging, but they feel cut off from mainstream life. And there was plenty of anticipation amongst the guests, most of whom had travelled considerable distances to relive history and walk in the footsteps of the Lost Franklin expedition. One young Scotsman, however, was an exception. His connection was not to Franklin. This young Scot was here because his uncle had been the last factor of the Hudson Bay Post in charge of the trading mission, and his job was to discover how his uncle disappeared 30 years before when a powerful snowstorm hit the community. He showed me the photograph of his uncle in front of the trading post, and as I wandered off to bed that night, the nephew was wandering through the undergrowth, holding up this grainy image against the lodge, trying to figure out how and where his uncle may have disappeared. Nearby Wilberforce waterfalls are deeper than Niagara Falls. Paige Burt's husky trotted alongside us as we completed one of these day-long expeditions, with picnic supplies and panniers hanging on either side of his considerable body. What I loved most about these walks were the giant Inukshuks, the herd of musk oxen, and the occasional pack of shy lone wolves skulking within earshot of our group. Paige Burt was educated in the United States, and she authored a wonderful book called Barren Land Beauties, a catalogue of Arctic plant life. Paige was able to bring alive the extraordinary natural history at Bathurst as we spent many happy hours traipsing over the tundra with a fabulous husky trotting alongside with picnic supplies strapped to his side. Often we made 10-hour hikes along the ridge behind the lodge across the Wilberforce waterfalls, and on occasions we were trailed by ghost-like wolf packs which silently reversed down the ridge when we approached them. It was an extraordinary feeling to hike along these ridges where no human foot had previously trodden, and the Inukshuks resembled giant human figures, arms outstretched with palms pointed upwards, exclaiming, "Did I not tell you how grand this land was?" The Inuit built these giant stone statuettes to help with herding musk oxen and caribou along hunting corridors so they could pick them off in the chosen killing field. Inukshuks also act as Arctic signposts to assist the Inuit to navigate through the challenging landscapes in winter when the visibility was marginal. This land is utterly magnificent, with what can best be described as immense skies tapering down to the ocean. And what is extraordinary is the fact that so few people live here and will ever even visit. The silence is exceptional, to the point where it almost becomes audible and can be mistaken for a combination of wind whistling through the short grass and the occasional gust as it came accelerating down the slope. Our other resident expert was Bishop Jack Sperry, the retired Bishop of the Arctic and the author of Igloo Dwellers Were My Church.
Jack was a Leicestershire man, coincidentally born not too far from Hank Franklin's home, and he became a missionary. He had his own dog team and travelled 3,000 miles each year to visit his parishioners along the Arctic coastline. He translated the St. James Bible into Inuktitut and was devoted to the well-being of the Inuit to this day. That evening at Bathurst Inlet, a lively discussion focused on possible reasons for Franklin's failure to complete his mission. Was he an incompetent leader? Was he unable to innovate and cope with local conditions? Was the expedition's ice planning information faulty? And were the leaders unaware that there were entire tribes of Inuit thriving and living quite nearby? Into these 20 questions catapulted the extraordinary 21st century research completed by forensic anthropologist Owen Beattie and the investigative reporter John Geiger, who together solved an important element in this mystery.
And who published this remarkable book called Frozen in Time.
Now, it will be helpful at this point if we reflect that England in the mid-1800s was a hotbed of technical innovation. To understand how this impacted Franklin, we need to focus on Cornwall in southern England, where new mining technologies were starting to emerge. The tin mines of Cornwall produced excellent quality metal that could be thinly cast and bent into what we now know as cans. The process was perfected in 1811 and instantly adopted by the Navy for use on all of its ships. Once formed, the cans were filled, heated and then sealed with solder or solder, whatever you call it, which in the mid-1800s, with its 19% lead content, was slowly poisoning Franklin's men, gradually lowering their ability to perform under stress with deadly consequences. It's now 1981, and Canadians Owen Beattie and John Geiger were to start unravelling parts of the mystery through a combination of excellent science and dogged research. And as Beattie had worked in cases for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he was the right scientist in the right place at the right time. The two forensic explorers used the same twin otters that flew us safely to Bathurst Inlet, although their route took them much further north to the high Arctic archipelago of King William Island, Devon Island, Erebus Bay, and finally tiny Beechey Island. They were heading for the grave sites of 3 expedition members, and thus began a series of visits to the high Arctic to take a detailed look at what evidence there was and to determine what evidence might have been missed. Clues soon emerged from bones and artifacts that Franklin's men were suffering from the dreaded scurvy. Beattie's assistant discovered an extraordinary artifact, the dark leather sole of an entire European boot with screws inserted from the inside with their points protruding below. Now, if you think of our modern Ice Age which clip onto our walking shoes, here was an crew member in the mid-1840s fabricating a similar device to make walking on the ice a bit safer. Beattie was able to identify several of the trace elements in these bones, reinforcing his opinion that scurvy and starvation might have prevented Franklin's crewmen from trekking out of danger due to the rapid weakening this would have induced. But it was the level of lead in the bones which really caught his attention. In comparable Inuit bones, for example, the lead level ranged from 22 parts to 36 parts per million. But in the bones of Franklin's men, the lead content averaged an astounding 228 parts per million. Beattie also contacted the British Admiralty, which is part of the Ministry of Defence, in order to alert any living relatives of the 3 mariners, and to facilitate this, an advert was placed in the Times of London. It's now August 1984, and because of the nature of his work, Beattie expanded the team to include an archaeologist and a pathologist. It's presumed that Franklin anticipated their first winter stuck in the ice, and officers and men were pretty well drilled in how to prepare for the onset of this bone-chilling weather, and they were huddled in this protective cove on this speck of land on Beechey Island. But not even their crude central heating could have prepared them for the energy-sucking effects of 24 hours of darkness, or the debilitating effects of sub-40-degree temperatures, or the incessant Arctic winds which raked Erebus and Terror, their sides creaking with the pressure of ice on their ribs. Then came the shocking death of John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Braine. It's now August 1984, and Beatty's team of science practitioners again approach Beechey Island in the venerable Twin Otter aircraft. The pilot of the Twin Otter deftly banked over the island, skimming above the graves, gently let the aircraft down alongside the graves. This was, in fact, an Arctic cemetery, and the graves were just a few feet above the ocean level. Work began on the graves, and with worsening weather there was an urgency to their progress. With the permafrost carefully chipped away, the first coffin was revealed to be extremely well made by an accomplished carpenter, and the entire structure was covered in blue fabric. And the challenge was how to remove this without causing irreversible damage to the corpse. The researchers assembled around the three forlorn graves, while colleagues stood by with loaded rifles to scare off inquisitive polar bears, and then the forensic team tenderly exhumed the three bodies. The wonderful book, Frozen in Time, and a video by the same publisher, tells the amazing story of this pathology expedition, which announced the stunning news that a previous similar expedition had also examined these crew members' bodies. Once carefully exhumed, they opened the coffin containing the body of able seaman John Torrington,
which you can see was carefully placed inside the coffin with his arms and hands tenderly bound to the side of his body and supported by muslin strips.
Who died January 1, 1846, at the age of 20. It was a true defining moment for the team. Months later, conclusive evidence, when they got it back to the laboratory, indicated the devastating effects of lead poisoning. Paradoxically, it seemed that contemporary technology in Franklin's day to preserve food was inhibiting their ability to survive. For Franklin's explorers to cope with the debilitating winter climate and extreme ice conditions was challenging enough, but to battle through those conditions while being poisoned by lead and rotten food was more than anyone could overcome. They decided to use hot water as the least invasive technique to thaw out these corpses, and before long a human chain of scientists form a hot bucket brigade between the camp stove and John Torrington's grave. It is hard to convey the atmosphere of sheer excitement amongst the team as the first view of John Torrington since 1846 came into view, as the hot water melted away the ice and our scientists came face to face with this man from Britain's exploration history. The process, perhaps better described as the ritual governing the exposure of John Torrington's face, was pursued with some delicacy. Beatty and his colleagues lifted Torrington out of the grave. He was reasonably light, and as they elevated the body, Torrington's head rotated across Beatty's shoulder, bringing the mariner and the scientist face to face, their gaze a few inches from each other. In preparation for the X-rays, Beatty noticed the emaciated state of the mariner's body, which showed the full extent of his illness. The team conducted a detailed autopsy, and during the autopsy, Torrington's face remained covered to preserve the privacy and the dignity of this former mariner. Even before the lab results would be complete, it was obvious that John Torrington was a sick man with numerous ailments which had contributed to his death. After gently returning the British mariner to his icy resting place, a note was placed inside the coffin with the names of the researchers and a summary of their feelings and why they were there. The weather was starting to deteriorate, but something was bothering Beatty about the appearance of John Hartnell's grave. There were inconsistencies in how the graves were covered up, and it soon became clear that Hartnell's grave might have been opened sometime in the past. Before too long, Hartnell's coffin was exposed, and they were able to pry open the lid to see a similar block of ice. So, using the same hot water technique, they were able to melt the permafrost, covering this mariner, and come face to face with John Hartnell. It's now June 1986, and Beatty was again returning to Beechey Island with an expanded team of researchers, including the 20th century relative of John Hartnell. Professor Spencerley of Thunder Bay, Ontario. The plan was to exhume the body of Hartnell and, using portable X-ray equipment, make a total photographic examination of the mariner. Once more, the arduous task of digging through the permafrost was undertaken, eventually allowing Professor Spencerley to come face to face with his ancestor. What happened next was quite dramatic, when someone exclaimed that the bodies had already been autopsied. And this suggested that shortly after his death, the surgeon on Erebus, Dr. Henry Godseer, who was an anatomist by training, had examined Hartnell to determine the cause of his death. The manner in which John Hartnell's organs were then replaced by the good doctor in his body were definitely not how nature had intended them to be arranged, and this showed clearly on the X-rays. A similar X-ray and an autopsy was then performed on John Brain's grave, with similar indications of lead poisoning, carbon monoxide poisoning from below deck heaters, and scurvy because of the diet with modest amounts of ascorbic acid. We had travelled from many corners of the former British Empire to be part of this exceptional glimpse into the life of Sir John Franklin and Lady Jane, and to walk in the footsteps of his lost expedition. Along this personal journey, we became familiar with the grass and the earth and the water where Franklin and his crew had sculled their boats and landed for an English tea break, and we truly walked in the footsteps of the Franklin expedition and those brave and unfortunate explorers. We gratefully basked in the unparalleled knowledge of Page Burt and Bishop John Sperry, and we have the benefit of Owen Beatty's superb research to make these conclusions. We'd made friends with our Inuit host in Bathurst Inlet, and none of this would have been possible without visionaries Glenn and Trish Warner, to whom I will always be grateful. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this episode of Stories for Grown-Ups. The Franklin expedition is a particularly special story, and I hope you have enjoyed travelling through the Arctic with me and might be inclined to purchase this wonderful book.